Let's go ahead and go into telecommunications. This is the fun one. This is the big one. A lot of the things on here have not changed in the last 20 years. Again, these are things that you're basically going to have to memorize. For example, like thin net, thick net. A lot of people do not use that anymore. You still may come across of it though, so that's something you basically just have to memorize. Okay, telecom and network objectives. I'm going to cover the TCP/IP suite, cabling, data transmission types, LAN versus WAN technologies. Has anybody heard what a MAN is? In the metropolitan area network. So basically that means a geographic area or entity that's in the same general geographic area, but it could be, for example, like campus or whatnot. There's also campus area networks, but a lot of people call those metropolitan area networks as well, city. Okay, network devices and services. We're also going to cover telecommunication protocols and devices, remote access methods and technologies, and of course, fault-tolerant mechanisms. Okay, agenda. We're going to cover cabling types, coaxial, twisted pair, and fiber. How many pairs can be in your average Cat5 twisted pair? UDP. Yep, 4. So there's going to be basically 8 wires or 8 cables, 4 pair. Anybody remember the coloring schemes?
White, blue, white, orange, white, blue, white, brown.
Yes. And then there's the 2 standards to where if you're going to cable from one system to another, a lot of people will put the example the green or the orange. They'll flip them just depending on if it's going to be AT&T or the other standard. There's also going to cover transmission types. Each has an advantage, disadvantage, and best environment to work in. But when it comes down to twisted pair, there's also going to be 2 different types. We'll get a little bit further, but there's going to be the shielded and then unshielded twisted pair. Okay, good old coaxial. This is radio frequency communication. There's copper wire insulated by a braided metallic ground shield. Less vulnerable to electrical interference. The twisted pair is definitely sensitive to that. Also 2 main types. There's thin net, which is 10 base 2, and then thick net, which is 10 base 5. Again, numbers or names to memorize. Coaxial characteristics used mainly one-way networks. Cable television and 2-way networks require specific switching equipment. A lot of the organizations would have your good old T's. So if you're going through and creating a network based off coax, you'll have it to where when anybody on the line drops, then basically the entire network segment after that last T is also dead. So it makes troubleshooting a little bit easier, but it also is the availability of the network is a lot less. Good old twisted pair. These are copper-based cable wiring. 2 main types. It's going to be shielded, which is extra hour foiling in the actual cable, and also unshielded or UTP. So you need to know the difference between STP and UDP. And UDP is the least secure type of the wiring, susceptible to electronic interference, crosstalk, eavesdropping. There's also coaxial and fiber, provide much more security. Most commonly used in cable LAN networks today. For example, like the Cat3 used to be the old one. I know a lot of telcos will still use Cat3 cabling. Some of them are moving to Cat5 just for your phone systems as well. Because a lot of digital phones will take the 2 pair as opposed to the 1 pair. So they'll go ahead and run Cat5 to the jack so you can actually have 2 digital phones there. One issue with that, I've seen a lot of places with unshielded twisted pair or the UTP, and it would pick up radio signals. So with that being said, they get a lot of data damage, especially if you're running a phone cable right next to it. You pick it up. A lot of times you'll also be hearing the radio on there as well. There's an issue with the frequency that the majority of the computers work on today. It is going to be running within the radio frequencies and some of the lower band TV frequencies. So if you have a huge tower that's broadcasting in a geographic area, if you don't have shielded twisted pair, you may be having interference issues.
It changes next year, right?
You would think. Well, there's still going to be a lot of broadcasts from the radio, but the digital stuff will minimize it. Okay, types of fiber. There's fiber characteristics, optical fiber. Basically, it's where data travels as photons. Type of glass where information moves as light. Basically, it's a lot higher speed. It's less attenuation and more secure than other cabling. Because, for example, with a coax, you had your good old vampire taps. In Cat 5, vampire taps were not as easy to do, but let's say if you had the time, technically you could chop a Cat 5, recrimp them, and then put your own little hub in there. Usually probably within about 5 minutes or so, relatively quick. But with fiber, it takes a lot longer to splice the fiber together. How many people have played around with that before? Yeah. It definitely takes an artist's touch. Good old line splicers. Okay, expensive and definitely hard to work with. Many scenarios, especially with large backbones today, you'll see a lot of fiber in a lot of, especially rural areas, because it's cheaper to dig, bless you, and build the infrastructure now before a lot of the other buildings or companies start going in. So you'll see a lot of rural areas with a lot of fiber built underground, and basically it's dark now, just waiting to be lit up as soon as more companies or businesses get into the area. One interesting thing though, like I mentioned before, the good old backhoes being the enemy of the internet, as soon as they cut these are more expensive to fix. They also take a lot longer because, again, a lot of the, you have to splice each strand together sometimes, and you also need to make sure things are clean. They do go a lot longer. If you go the old copper wire, like the UDP and whatnot, then you're going to get attenuation after a certain period of time. However, I have come across, in real life, some cable splicers or line splicers at the telco that basically went well above and beyond the standards of your good old Cat 5. And basically they say after a certain period of length, it should not be able to hold 10/100 signal. And you should also have it whenever you crimp it. It shouldn't be more than 1/4 inch of exposed wire whenever it goes into the actual cable. But I've actually seen people get punch down blocks, basically bounce about 100 yards of cable to a punch down block, another 100 yards of cable, and then another punch down block, and so forth. And then, of course, have more than their good old 1/4 inch and still get 10/100 speed on this thing. But as far as the test, you need to know that absolute numbers that you should not go beyond. And the issue is, especially with Cat 5, Cat 6, or whatnot, with the attenuation issue, they really push, we'll get into that shortly, but repeaters, which are basically signal enhancers. So whenever they get the signal, then they just basically beef it up and then rebroadcast it. Okay, signal and cable issues. Good timing. Signal and cable issues. Basically, there's attenuation, which is degradation of the signal as it travels. It interferes from the environment. There's interferes from other cables running right next to it. Cable runs are too long or poor quality of the cable. And I've also seen if you untwist the cable too far, for example, an inch or so, and then actually crimp it off, a lot of times it will not allow you to do 100. It'll only go down to 10. And radio, there's electromagnetic interference. There's also radio frequency interference. There's crosstalk. It's basically where electric signals radiate from the wire and interfere with data on different wires. So it can cause data corruption and most susceptible for unshielded twisted pair or UTP cable. I've also seen the issue to where there's, again, the dual grounding, which is going to be because it's copper, electricity goes over path of least resistance and then goes over the network cable as opposed to going to the actual ground because it's transferring from one ground to the other ground. Okay, transmission types. You're going to go through analog and digital. You have your carrier signals used to move data in the analog mode. Signals work on different frequencies. Then you also have it used for broadband networks. And how many people here deal with DSL? You're going to need to know that technology as well, such as DSL goes over your good old tip and ring telephony services, but it goes at a higher frequency. So a lot of times, if you have a regular phone system, you'll actually have to have filters on your phone system so you don't get the high pitch or you don't get interference in your DSL, mainly just because the bounce back of the frequency portion. It's all analog. Okay, digital. Basically, there's discrete units of voltage that move data in binary representations on a clear signal compared to analog, because again, analog has more variations. Okay, there's synchronous and asynchronous types. Synchronous transmissions, basically prior agreement to the data transmission rules set by specific protocols being used. And a sending system sends back a clocking pulse for the data to be sent. There's a stop and start bits are not required in asynchronous transmissions. In telecommunication lines, use synchronous transmissions by default. In asynchronous transmissions, these are systems have not previously agreed upon synchronization, and these are very similar to your good old dial-up connections. There's baseband and broadband. Baseband or transmission media only uses one channel. There's digital signaling, and then there's also uses over twisted pair or coaxial. There's broadband. Systems use dedicated frequencies to support multiple channels, transmit more data at one time compared to baseband. Used mainly over coaxial and fiber networks or channeling, and carry out video, of course, voice, data, and images. Basically anything that's large data transfers. Okay, cabling issues. Good old plenum rating. Basically safety issues pertaining to fire. Non-plenum rated cables can give off dangerous chemicals and burned. Plenum rating cables do not often release these types of chemicals. And also plenum rated cabling should be used in building plenum areas. Basically drops in the ceilings and raised floors and so forth. Okay, transmission types. Numbers and receivers. There's the unicast, which is one system communicates with one system. So it's a system to system. There's multicast, which is one system communicates with many others. And then there's broadcast. One system communicates to the systems on a specific subnet. So it's going to be the main difference between multicast and broadcast is it tries to talk to everybody versus multicast, it only tries to talk to ones that are listening. Okay, in this area, we're going to cover network types, physical topologies, and media access technologies. The goal network types and physical topologies. How many people, before we go there, know the difference between like a star network and a ring network? Basically, you have a ring network. Of course, it generally is going to look like a ring. Granted, you can have pipes going off of it, but with a star network, everything comes into like a switch or a hub, then branches off, and then you can have multiple nodes outside of that as well. Okay, LAN, local area network. It's covering a limited geographic area. It could be Ethernet, token ring, or basically anything that connects systems to systems, but it's going to be, for example, in a building. All the computers within this building, when they're hooked up, are technically part of a LAN. But if you had, let's say, multiple hotels within this city or whatnot connected together within the same network, then it would probably be considered an extranet, but then it would also be considered usually a metropolitan area network because it's going to be all throughout the organization or geographic area. But metropolitan area network, this is a network that extends over a city or town. And again, it doesn't have to extend over the whole city, mainly just more than just a campus. Because a lot of campuses will have, let's say, 4 or 5 buildings, but they're very close together. This is something that you may be several blocks away or a mile away or so. Then wide area network, covering a wide geographic area. A lot of items that will do this, of course, would be ATM, frame relay, X25. Okay, this right here.
So
yes.
Large organizations that are behind firewalls that have their own IPs are considered wide.
If they have wide geographic area expanse, yes. For example, if one's in New York and one's in California, that would be a wide area network. However, if you had, let's say, 5 locations in New York City itself, that would just be a metropolitan area network because it's covering the city, which is a smaller geographic expanse. Even though they're far apart from each other, they're not that far. So, and they really try to push the technologies per se. For example, like SONET rings or FDDI is more reliable in a smaller geographic rather than like ATM versus larger expanse. So, and then here, same type of scenario. If you have a large organization, they have all their own IP ranges or whatnot. Of course, there's the internet, which is the world's biggest network. There's the intranet, which is going to be an internet-like network, but only within an individual company. So you could have, let's say, buildings all throughout the U.S., all throughout the world. If they all connect into the same organization, if they're not remoted in or whatnot, if there's just one big organization, that could theoretically be an intranet, but usually the intranets are, say within this building, they have a web server, which is going to be your employee login page or a time card type scenario. that is going to be your intranet. It has a HTTP server, possibly FTP, same type of servers you'd see on the internet. The extranet is basically an intranet, but what it has is the remote systems. So you're going to have a shared DMZ, you'll have remote connections, dial-up connections, VPN connections, just other types of connections outside the organization.
Have VPN and intranet though? Intranet?
You can, but then it turns into an extranet. As soon as you have external users, then the intranet becomes an extranet. So yeah, yeah, that's the only difference. And what they really try to push really is that as soon as you have external users, then you really should start putting in protection like you would on the internet, and pretends that they are just as untrusted as an internet user. So you have the firewall in between where they connect into and your regular network. So that's where the DMZs come into effect. Okay, DMZ. Does anybody know what DMZ stands for in the network world? Correct. So, yeah, same thing as basic military. It's demilitarized zone. The DMZ is a network segment that is between the protected internal network and the external non-trusted network. So when it comes down to it, it's either going to be the internet or it's going to be where all of your remote access users are coming in. So you can have multiple DMZs or protected subnets within an environment. It also creates a buffer zone between internal and external network. And systems in a DMZ will be the first to come under attack. And with that being said, what kind of systems would you want to put in a DMZ?
Bank?
Sorry?
Like a bank?
Yes. Let's say a bank organization, what kind of servers would they want to put out on the DMZ?
Public web servers.
Yeah, public web servers.
Dial into do online banking or something.
Yep. Basically anything that you want people from the outside to get into. So you're going to have a specific protection on it, but you're also going to have a specific layer of trust from the outside world. For example, if they do online banking, you'd have the capability for them to get onto your website. So you may be blocking all ports but port 80 and port 443, which is going to be for your encryption by default, which can be other ports. But let's say you're doing HTTPS on that site. You're probably not going to blacklist a lot of the IP addresses, so you're going to allow everybody to come in, but you're going to make it to where only specific ports are going to be connecting in. So if anybody attacks the system, then theoretically it's another layer because you have a firewall on the inside to where only specific IP addresses from within that DMZ can communicate back and forth, if at all. Yes. Oh. I know from an attacker's perspective, what they try to do is they try to compromise one, and then knowing that the internal network's probably on a different subnet, or hopefully will be. And a lot of times they'll only have pinholing. For example, the web server's only access to the internal side, or potentially even another DMZ, is to a database server on a specific port. And then only that specific web server can communicate with that database server. So then it basically vets it even more. So the attacker basically has to be more sophisticated. If they're able to do an attack on one system, they may have to do what's called island hopping and go to other systems beside it in that DMZ to be able to get further into the network. But the majority, unfortunately, of a lot of systems, they either A, have the database in the DMZ, which is dangerous as well, or if they have it inside the internal network, they have it to where a lot of the vulnerabilities are within the web page itself and the queries it sends to the server inside the network. So if you're able to do SQL injection and run code on the SQL server, then you've just bypassed the DMZ and are now on the internal side. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration when building e-commerce sites. Okay, good old topology at the physical layer. Physical connections of systems and devices. We can also cover architectural layout of a network. And choice of topology should be determined by the higher level technologies you'll be running on it. The common things you will come across are bus, ring, star, and mesh. Mesh, however, is going to be far more expensive than probably anything else. However, this is a reliable topology because if one link fails, there's multiple connections back and forth. But yeah, true mesh is going to be, let's say, 4 nodes, and all 4 nodes are connected to all 4 other nodes. But most places have it to where, say, if they have 100 systems, they'll have a partial mesh. So they'll have multiple connections from multiple servers going different routes, basically redundancies, but they're not going to have every single node connecting to every other single node. Okay, bus definition. So we have nodes are connected to a backbone through cable drops. Two main types. There's the linear bus, which is one cable with no cable branch offs. And then there's the tree topology, which is a network with branches of the cables. So you're going to have your main line, then you're going to have a T connector, and that T connector is going to have another line, and potentially a T connector off that line. So there's also bus characteristics. Easy to extend because of the simplicity of the layout. If one node fails, it can negatively affect all other nodes. And again, this is great for finding out where the break is, because if all the computers past, let's say, workstation 21, 22, and 23 are all dead, you know that it's probably at 21 or previous to 21. Okay, a cable is a single point of failure. Okay, ring definition. Basically, interconnection of the nodes in a circular manner. Each node is dependent upon the physical connection of the upstream node, and data travels in a unidirectional fashion. And for those, I keep mentioning the term node, and here as well, basically node is an asset. It's an asset that's connected to the network somehow. Usually when people are referring to nodes, it's either a computer, a switch, a router, or some sort of item that is basically a stopping point. A lot of times they'll have their own IP addresses, or there'll be management interfaces that's like a hub, which is basically a multi-port repeater. Okay, ring characteristics. If one fails, it can negatively affect the surrounding nodes and use more in smaller networks. Okay, star characteristics. These are the more common ones used today. As it comes down to it, all computers are connected to a central device, either a switch or a hub. Central device is a single point of failure, and no node-to-node dependencies. And of course, there's the mesh. It's a network using many paths and endpoints. Between transparent rerouting, when link gets down or congested, a lot of times they'll have throttling or things to where if one pipe is at, say, 50%, then it's going to start pushing data down another pipe. So there's quality of service built in there as well in most systems. There's partial mesh. Not every computer is directly connected to every other computer. And then there's full mesh. Every computer is directly connected to every other computer. Highly redundant, but extremely expensive. When would be a scenario that you might want to do that? Probably if you don't have too many nodes and potentially relatively close together, so latency issues, maybe even a clustering network as well. So, okay, summary of topologies. So one of the better slides, this is one to burn into your memory. As far as the bus is a linear single cable for all computers attached. There's the ring. All computers are connected in the unidirectional transmission link. There's the star. All computers are connected to a central device. And what link does tree fit into? Yep. So it's not going to be a straight line, but it's going to be branches off that straight line. Still, if one link dies, the rest down the line also die. And then mesh, where computers are connected to each other, which provides redundancy. And then there's also the partial mesh, which is still mesh technology. Okay, LAN media access technologies. Here we're going to cover the data link layer. Basically, this is where media access technologies dictate how systems will access shared media and how systems will communicate. So different media access technologies, which would be the CSMA, or Carrier Sense Multiple Access, used by Ethernet and wireless technologies. There's the token passing, used by Token Ring, FDDI, and ArcNet. Then there's the polling, used by some of the mainframe communication protocols. And you'll see the CSMA quite a bit in, for example, like the switching and whatnot, basically trying to make it to where things don't collide as much. So the CSMA collision detection, or CD, each computer monitors the shared media and knows when its line is free and to send data back and forth. When the cable is not busy, then the computer uses the cable to send the data, and it uses Ethernet. On the collision avoidance, or the CSMA, collision avoidance, this also listens to determine how busy the shared media is, sends out a message telling the other nodes that it's going to be sending the data. All other nodes then take a step back if it's not an urgent message that's going back and forth. And then basically it's sent and it's used in good old wireless, right up to 11. With 802.11, what are the common speeds for 802.11? Or the common maximum speeds, actually? For 802.11a, b, g?
11, 54,
So 11 and 54 are the common ones. Yeah, they go to super.
Super G or
Yeah, it's where they double it. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, these are things basically commit to memory as well. The 802.11 is going to be your 2.4 gigahertz range. B is 2.4 gigahertz range, and G is 2.4 gigahertz range. A is the one that they tried to move things a little bit, and it's at the 5 gigahertz range. A is just as fast as G is. However, A does not go as far because the frequency is more erratic. So basically, whenever you get higher frequencies, you need more energy to push those higher frequencies further, because the energy is dissipated going the up and down as opposed to longitudinal. The speed for 802.11b is going to be your 11. A and G is 54. It's good to know I as well. Basically, it's a newer one. And then 15 and 16. 15's for the wireless personal area network, and 16's wireless metropolitan area network. But the common ones that you will come across, especially with laptops and whatnot, are going to be your good old 802.11, probably B and G. I know a lot of people are going back to A, mainly because security by obscurity, because they're figuring a lot of people that are using the hacking tools do not have an A card. So they're trying to protect themselves in that aspect. Okay, this is kind of a tricky one as well. Access point is your basic AP. Some people call them wireless access points, so WAPs. However, WP is actually a wireless application protocol, so it basically means to where if somebody's trying to write for like cell phones or PDAs or whatnot, that's basically a way to write an HTTP similar protocol. So depending on the context of the question, if it's WAP referring to a hardware device, it's going to be wireless access point. If it's WAP referring to coding, it's going to be similar to HTTP. But access points, basically these connect wireless networks to a wired network. A wireless device must authenticate to an access point before gaining access to a wired environment. Also, access points work on a specific frequency that the wireless device must basically tune itself into. Does anybody know the channels for that? Here in the States, at least.
1 to 11?
Yep. And then across the ponds, they go up a little bit as well. So if you're looking at some of the access points, if they go, for example, up to 14, then you know that it has capabilities of connecting with like UK signal ranges. But yeah, in the States, it's 1 through 11. Okay, SSID. This is basically going to be the name of the access point. WLANs, it's your wireless LANs. These can be logically separated, just as networks can, using subnet addresses. Basically, you can have it to where there's several different access points running on the same channel or the same frequency. One might be, say, XYZ. The other one's going to be 123. So whenever you're looking for the SSID 123, it's going to connect to that network as opposed to the other network. That's where the rogue access points come into play. And sometimes they will find somebody's SSID, basically duplicate that SSID, and then put their rogue access point in the same general location as the legitimate access point, and try to get people to hop onto theirs as opposed to the real one.
What's the difference between SSID and MAC address?
The SSID is the name, so it's basically a human readable name. The MAC address is going to be the hardware identifier. And the MAC address is going to be on each network device, such as your Ethernet network device or NIC card, and then your wireless as well. And the MAC is actually going to be your BSSID. Okay, wireless devices and APs use the SSID when authenticating and associating, and should not be considered a security mechanism. And here's the beautiful part about it. It says many access points broadcast their SSID values, and that is true. If you turn that off and have it to where it's no longer broadcasting, the very interesting thing is if you're using programs like Kismet or any other programs that's actually listening to the communications over the airwaves, you will actually get the name of the SSID eventually, because either A, this AP is going to be broadcasting it every once in a while, even though you say don't broadcast it. Or B, a client's going to connect to it and say, I'm looking for this SSID. And then the access point is going to say, hey, I'm that SSID, let's talk. And now you instantly grab the name. So if you're not broadcasting it, it's not a security mechanism, but again, it's going to prevent a lot of people from accidentally connecting to you. So back to the 80-20 rule. However, if you have an SSID of Linksys and you're not broadcasting the SSID, that's not going to make a bit of difference because there's a lot of people that automatically connect to Linksys by default because they have one at home. So if you're going to not broadcast your SSID, at least change the SSID. Okay, authenticating to an access point. Two main ways of authentication. Station sends a probe to all channels or frequencies looking for the closest access point. And what most places usually do is, let's say they have 3 access points in a geographic area. They're going to have the same SSID, but they're going to be on different channels. And the reason why they want to be on different channels, so there's no conflictions within the frequencies, kicking people off and whatnot. The access point will respond in the necessary information in the request for the credentials. If the access point requires the device to prove it has a certain web key or shared key, the AP then sends a challenge to the device. The device encrypts the challenge with a web key and then sends it back. If the AP does not require a web key or an open system authentication, it looks for a SID value and then a MAC value. With WEP, memorize the name. It's going to be wired equivalent privacy. Not just this test, but almost every security test that has a wireless question is probably going to ask you what that means. They may say protocol, they may say other names, but you need to know that it's wired equivalent privacy. This is a protocol used to encrypt all traffic within an IEEE wireless standards. Standard is riddled with security flaws. Basically, it's most insecurities come from the improper implementation of security mechanisms. What's interesting about the WEP and the security side is that the keys are relatively short, they're relatively weak, and it basically can send the same key over and over again, and what you end up doing is doing a statistical analysis attack on the communications going back and forth. So if you can generate enough IV packets or interesting packets, then what's going to happen is you can start to do the attack against the transmissions going back and forth, and you crack it relatively quickly. And a lot of the software, or primarily if you use, for example, like AirCrack, you can do it with only about 30,000 packets. Okay, WEP, wired equivalent privacy. Definitely just the key term to memorize. It's the same symmetric key implementation. Basically, there's no randomness added, and that's another reason why you can crack it, because same keys going back and forth. You're just looking for the variations in it. Then no automated dynamic key refresh model. So basically, today we have many key arrangements and exchange protocols and algorithms. And with that being said, a lot of people will also have it where they won't automatically change the key, let's say every 90 days to 30 days, because they want all their remote systems to be able to connect without having to generate tech support calls. So they'll keep the same WEP key for a year at a time, and then possibly push it to another area. Okay, other WEP woes. Basically a small initialization vector, which is the interesting packet or the IV packet. The seeding value is basically used to undo randomness. There's SSL and PPT meet a similar fate. There's a stream versus block cipher. It's more difficult to implement a stream cipher securely. And data can be modified without the receiver knowing it. And that's the beautiful thing about Wi-Fi in general. WPA, WPA2, this is something you need to know is more secure than WEP, even though the recent white papers that have come out. This is for Wi-Fi protected access. Know the name for this one. This protocol was created in response to several serious weaknesses with WEP. There are 2 flavors. There's the Enterprise. This is meant for use with the IEEE 802.1x authentication server. There's also Personal WEP for PSK, which utilizes a less scalable pre-shared key. Okay, WAP, like I mentioned before, the Wireless Application Protocol. If you see a WAP, when it's talking about a hardware access point, they're probably referring to wireless access point, which is more than likely only going to be AP, but there's just the possibility they may add the W to it. But Wireless Application Protocol, this is basically made specifically for wireless devices. Many wireless devices do not use the same resources as the PC, so when they try to make it, there's a lot less overhead, so they can still get web pages and other type of content back and forth to the PDAs and cell phone type technology. Okay, GAP and WAP. Basically a device on the internet understand TCP/IP and not WAP because it's a cut down version of TCP/IP. Data that is encrypted with WTLS must be decrypted and re-encrypted with SSL or TLS. WTLS is the WAP TLS, and then TLS is basically the advancement in SSL encryption. I know a lot of websites are making it to where they're using the TLS, which is just basically harder to crack than SSL. Okay, attacks on wireless LANs. Basically, there's eavesdropping on traffic and spoofing. And eavesdropping is if you don't encrypt, then everything's in clear text. There's I'm erecting rogue access points. And you can either do one, and hopefully somebody will connect to you, but a lot of the wireless IPSs will try to prevent that. So if you have multiple rogue access points, that'll defeat a lot of the wireless IPSs out there. There's a man in the middle, all traffic going through the attacker system without the user knowing it. Again, sometimes the man in the middle will be either an access point where they get you to connect to, and then they connect to the real network. That's a fun one. And then there's also the ones like AirPwn, to where you're doing a man in the middle, but what you're doing is you're listening for a signal to be broadcast, and then you're rebroadcasting the signal immediately, pretending to be the gateway, pretending to be the other item. There's unauthorized modification of data, gaining access to the wired network, war driving. There's also cracking WEP, collision attacks, and weak key access. The war driving, that is basically something it's catch and release fishing for geeks. It's not something that when you see a wireless access point, you're supposed to connect to it. I know a lot of people will say that war driving is the act of finding access points out there and then cracking them. War driving, that is not the true meaning of it. It's somebody going around looking for wireless access points and then sometimes even using GPS and then basically monitoring those and putting them in some sort of map or some sort of database. But it's something that if you do find something that's encrypted, you're actually breaking the law if you go to the next step and say, okay, this is a WEP key, now I'm going to try to crack that key. Or you're in a residential area, then you say that here's some open wireless, I'm going to now connect to these open wireless. That's at a minimum can be unauthorized access and then possibly theft of services, because it's the same type of thing if you're stealing cable from your neighbor as well.
Why is it called war?
Basically named off the war dialing, which was off War Games. It's a good old movie War Games with Matthew Broderick when he was going through each individual number trying to find modems in California or whatnot. And then it was bounced to the good old Whopper, which was in the movie it was at NORAD. And so basically they use that same thing because it's the same type of area to where you're brute forcing things by sending packets out or just listening to packets for open computer networks. There are two types of war driving technologies as far as sniffers go. For example, NetStumbler. NetStumbler is an aggressive sniffer. What it does is it goes through every channel that it has available and basically does the Marco Polo thing. It yells out and says, anybody there? And then listens for people to call back at. As soon as it finds that, then it lists it. Kismet is a passive sniffer. It is one that doesn't go out and say, hey, you're there, go out and channel. It does channel hop, but what it does is it listens for packets over that channel. As soon as it hears something, it then puts that in its database. If you are driving, for example, war driving, and you're going at any sort of speed, NetStumbler is going to be by far better because it's extremely loud and it's going to get the content back. If you are stationary or going extremely slow, Kismet's probably going to be better because it gets a lot more information than NetStumbler. So it's basically one of the pick your poison type scenarios. If you're war walking, Kismet's probably going to be your best utility. If you're war driving, NetStumbler's probably going to be your best utility. NetStumbler, however, should, by default, light up a wireless IPS like a Christmas tree, because it sees things that are scanning. It's going to say, hey, this is not legitimate, and then either try to attack that access point or try to block everybody from touching that access point. With Kismet, it should not trip the majority of IPSs. Okay, NetStumbler finds access points and logs them. You're looking for network name or SSID, MAC address of the AP. You'll find that with the AeroDump. You'll find that with Wireshark, Ethereal. AeroDump I have used not really for war driving, but to see what's out there. Because basically what it'll show you are all of the access points and then all the users connecting to the access points in a nice text-based format. But what's nice about Kismet does the same thing, but it makes it to where any connection to an access point, it's going to filter and attach to that access point. For example, if you open up Kismet, you hit S for sort, and then sort by SSID. It's going to have an alphabetical representation of all the access points you have in the area. And then if you go down to the specific access point of interest and you hit C, or actually hit enter, it's going to show you the information of that access point. If you hit C, it's going to show all the clients connected to that access point. From there, from the attacker perspective, they can see what systems are not only communicating, but who is communicating a lot. And then what the attacker will do is look for the top talkers and basically say that these 3 systems within the last 10 minutes have transmitted a meg of data, so chances are they've already authenticated the system because data is going through. So then you grab that MAC address of the client that's connected to the access point and then spoof that, and therefore you can bypass the majority of MAC filtering. With NetStumbler, it's not as granular. It gives you the access points that are out there, but it does not give you the clients that are connecting to the access points.
These are all open source apps?
NetStumbler's not open source, but it's free. With Kismet, you can look at a lot of the code as well. Like the aircrack utilities, those are free. NetStumbler is going to be on your Windows. You can use Kane as well to do a lot of the same things that NetStumbler will do, because the new version of Kane does the Wi-Fi, except it does not have GPS. So if you're doing war driving, NetStumbler is very good for that, is because it works with almost any GPS utility. But yeah, the TCP dump and Ethereal. CAIN. It's the password cracking utility. It's basically an all-in-one Windows hacking utility. It will do brute force attacks. It will do hacking for dictionary attacks, for like LM hash, MD5, things like that. So it'll crack passwords. That's originally what it's designed for. And what's nice about it is not only does that, it does the sniffing for the access points that are out there. And then it will also do ARP poisoning. So if you want to sniff passwords, you basically say that you're this target and you're also the gateway. So anything that target does on the internet is now going to go through you because you're ARP poisoning. You can also do DNS poisoning. So whatever website they go to, you can now force to a different IP address. Basically change the DNS records. For example, if an attacker knew that you were going to xyzbank.com or whatnot, they can do an ARP poisoning between you and the internet gateway. They can do a DNS poisoning between basically all traffic going in between it. So as soon as you go to that domain, they can force it to that DNS record goes to localhost or 127.0.0.1. It then is going to go to that system, whatever's going to be listening on port 443, which either A, is going to be their own bank account or their own bank website, or B, it could be the proxy server that's going to bounce them to the real legitimate website. So the best part about that is now you can sniff all their usernames and passwords. Then you can also change any content that they're sending to the web server. So if you're using a proxy like Burp Suite, Paros proxy, or WebScarab, things like that, you could then trap all the messages going from the target to their web server and then change, let's say, account information and have it to where they dump all the money from their account into your account, which I definitely don't suggest because for one thing, that's illegal. But another thing, if you're a criminal trying to do it, I definitely would suggest it because everybody's going to see the transfer of money going from their account to your account. It's going to be easy to track down and arrest you. Okay, countermeasures with Wi-Fi. You can control Wi-Fi access. You can either enable WPA or WPA2 instead of WEP. Change default SSID, because again, if it's the default SSID, chances are everything else is default too. If it's Linksys, or if it's Netgear, or the plethora of the other defaults, you are going to be a lowest hanging fruit. So you will be a target for the majority of people that are just going through. Yes?
You're talking about the SSID on the access point?
Yes. So like when you get a Linksys right out of the box, it's automatically Linksys. So it's definitely a good idea to change that to something other than Linksys. Because especially if people know that the access point's Linksys, chances are the IP address is going to be 192.168.1.1 or .0.1, depending on the version or whatnot. There's no password, there's no username, and the password's at admin. So if they're able to get onto the Wi-Fi because it's unencrypted, they can easily start changing things on the Wi-Fi. And I have had horror stories told to me about people doing that, how they would see an unencrypted Wi-Fi, then they just start changing all kinds of things, kicking people off, doing MAC filtering to make sure that the people's Macs that they did have would no longer be able to connect to the device. So it's definitely something that you should change the default SSID because you will be a target more likely, or it's more probable that they're going to target you rather than somebody with a different SSID. Okay, also disable broadcast SSID on the IP. Again, if you don't change the default SSID, people still will probably be accidentally connecting to you because it's broadcasting from the client to the access point, and it'll allow the people to go through. But that's one thing is that some access points, if you disable broadcasting, if nobody connects to it, and if you're listening in, you're probably not going to get the name of the SSID. But as soon as somebody connects to you, if somebody's listening, they will get that access point. Okay, implement radius or Kerberos. Physically put the access point in the center of the building. Basically what they're trying to do there is minimize the signal strength. There's also ways to do that as well within the access point, and you can do that with technology or put impeders on it. I again have had scenarios to where individuals would have, for example, a conference room where they want all the vendors to be able to get internet access because it's caveated away or segmented away from the rest of the network, but it has, let's say, DSL connection directly to it. So they have this access point in the conference room. They put this metal barrier on the top of the access point so the people on the top floor or the floor right above them can't get the signal. And then they also try to dial it down so the people below them can't get the signal. They may put some sort of carpet trying to make their own little Faraday cage. It's funny though, is every once in a while these conference rooms are right on the outside of the building, so they have these huge windows. And what's even better about it is that if they're right next door to some of these other buildings that have the good old black shiny windows, because they don't want people seeing in, they're very reflective. So granted, the people on the floor right above and the floor right below may not be able to see it, but everybody else in the building can see it, the signal, because it bounces off the building on the other side. So definitely controlling the span of the radio waves is important, and the signal strength. However, it also depends on the antenna strength of the potential attacker, because you can dial the signal strength down quite a bit, and if they have a really high-powered antenna, they can still pick up things. So it goes back to the Tempest type scenario. If you tune in the right frequencies and you have the right powered antenna, you can still pick it up. Okay, place the AP in a DMZ. I've seen a lot of scenarios where hotels do this opposite. What they end up doing is they have a network, and they have their internal network as the DMZ, and then they branch off the wireless from their internal network. When it should be is the DMZ should contain the access point, and then there should be a firewall, and then the rest of the hotel internal network. And unfortunately, you'll see this happen a lot because the people that are setting up the wireless are not network engineers. They may be data technicians or line splicers, or from a telco environment rather than a network engineering environment.
Or somebody who works for the hotel just reading the
Yep. Somebody who works for the hotel says, well, it works. We get direct internet, and if their side goes down, it doesn't care. It's not going to affect our internet connection. And that's the worst thing you could possibly do. Because with that being said, if they're sniffing or if they're attacking, now they're basically going to the upstream provider, which is the hotel, which now they can try to get into the rest of the systems. Okay, assign IP addresses to stations and disable DHCP. DHCP is great if you have less resources than you have individuals or assets. This used to be really important for dial-up networks because you'd have, for example, 8 users per line. So what you were banking on is that they would never get busy signals, you would never run out of IP space, because out of all your users, you'd only have, let's say, 20% usage at any given time. If you have the IP space, you always want to put static for the main reason in this type of scenario, it provides accountability because a lot of devices do not have DHCP logs that are very good. Faking a MAC address will have it to where if you do DHCP, if somebody fakes a MAC address, they'll able to get a DHCP address and then get right into your network. But if you do not allow DHCP, then they also have to sniff to see what IP addresses are being flown over as well. So it makes it a little bit harder for a wireless access point to be subject to attack. Not impossible, but just makes it that 80-20 rule. Okay, the OSI model. This basically another slide you need to memorize. When it comes down to it, you have your OSI, and then you have your internet layer, which is basically your DoD standard. The internet layer is going to be your top three, the next one, the next layer, and then the bottom two. So basically, if you just remember that the both ends are going to be tied together, it's going to help you memorize what layers are going to contain what. But the OSI, one way of remembering it as well, there's one saying that says, all people seem to need data processors. Interesting sentence that helps people remember that it's the application, presentation, session, transport, network, data link, and physical. The hubs, like we mentioned before, hubs are going to be hardware layer. It's going to be your physical layer. Same as switches, it's going to be your data link layer. But as far as the internet layer, not the OSI, both a hub and a switch are going to be in the same layer. The router is the only thing that breaks out of that, because that's going to be your layer 3 on the OSI or the second layer on the network or internet layer. So unfortunately, these are just things you need to memorize. Okay, ports and protocol relationships. You have your TCP/IP suite, usage of ports. Port numbers mapped to a specific protocol. For example, 20 and 21 are generally going to be your FTP ports or protocols. So anybody using an FTP server, it's going to be by default be listening on port 21. And then the data transfer is going to be basically pushed down to port 20. It doesn't mean that every time that you see port 21 open, it will be FTP. Because it could be a telnet server, it could be a web server, it could be anything and everything, it could be a Trojan on that port. But the common ports to memorize are FTP is generally on 20 and 21. 20 is the one's the connection, 20 is the data. SMTP is 25, which is outgoing email. SNMP, which is port 161 UDP, and also it's 162 UDP. All of these are going to be TCP except for SNMP. SNMP is basically for network protocol. Basically allows you to communicate with network devices to see what the uptime is, what the system name is, and usually has two strings, a public and a private string. A public string is going to be a read-only string, so you can get all the information from the device, but you can't change anything. The private string is going to be the read-write string. So if you get the public name, you won't be able to alter it, but if you get the private name, you may be able to alter the device, such as change the IP address, possibly change the MAC address. Sometimes you can even dump a router config, so you can get the passwords on the router. But this one right here, this is the oddball out. SNMP is UDP 161, and the trap messages for SNMP are pushed on 162. What was that? Yes, it's UDP. The rest on here are TCP. You also need to know HTTP, which is port 80. There's 443, which is going to be HTTPS traditionally. And Telnet on port 23. HTTPS is traditionally 443. You can, however, see other ones that are common are going to be your 8000, your 8080, your 8888. Those are three common ones that you might see administrative web servers on, or even test web servers, where somebody has something that they want to test a secondary website on. This number right here is another thing you basically just need to memorize. Source port's usually a dynamic number, while the destination port is usually under 1024, some of the common ports. On a Windows system, 1025 is usually the first dynamic ports that it sets up. That's going to be, for example, the first socket connection you make usually is going to bump you up to 1025 and then so forth. So if you turn on your system and do a net stat minus A, you may see a bunch of connections that, for example, start at 1030 and then go up to 1057 or 1058. When it comes down to it, is you've probably made several socket connections that dropped off, and then the next available connection was 1030, then the next one was 1031, and so forth. But the 1024 is definitely one to know, is that up to there is basically your registered common ports. What protocol is going to be on 3389? Yep. Or what program would be running on it? Yep. Remote desktop. So like terminal service. Oh, I thought you said, all right, okay. Yeah, remote desktop. But that's a lot of times, if you see 3389 running, by default, the first thing to assume is it's probably going to be like a terminal server type scenario. So you may be able to connect to like a Windows 2000 that way. Okay, TCP and UDP use the ports to communicate with the upper protocols. And the ports are going to be 0 to 65,535. So you have 65,536 available ports. Just like in the IP range, you're not supposed to be able to use the top or the bottom. However, a lot of people scan 1 through 65,535. I have seen instances to where malware was actually listening on port 0. And that's going to bypass the majority of people that are trying to do their full scan, still miss it. Okay, ARP. ARP is the Address Resolution Protocol. Basically maps the IP address to the Media Access Controller, MAC. Basically, the MAC address is going to be the first 3 hex characters or the manufacturer, and that's going to be the first half of the MAC address. And that's going to be registered to that manufacturer. The next 3 hex characters, when you look at it, it's going to be 6 ASCII. That is going to be the individual identifier for that item. Basically, what that's stating is that you have 16 times 16 times 16 possibilities for whatever item is going to be on that network, and that's going to be that last half of the MAC address. So it's very similar to an IP address, but it's from the hardware level and is specifically attached to the network card. Okay, IP address is 32-bit software assigned number. It's at the network layer. The MAC address is a 48-bit hardwired into the NIC, and it's going to be at the data layer. The MAC address can be faked, especially on the majority of the OSs now, which means that you can have a different IP address and still get the traffic, basically fooling the switch into giving you it is not yours. Okay, the ARP, basically it's the data link layer. Protocols understand MAC addresses, not IP addresses. So you're going to have your physical layer, which is going to be basically your electricity going back and forth, your ones and zeros, and that's going to be your hub. And then at your layer 2, you're going to have your switch, which is going to be able to translate the MAC address or ARP or whatnot to where it's supposed to go.
So switches control the pass, no pass activity based on MAC addresses.
Yes. And what's interesting about a switch is it'll say, okay, this MAC address is assigned to this physical port on the switch. So whoever on whatever port wants to talk to a specific MAC address, it then has that little computer chip that says where it's supposed to go. It hits that through the ARP cache on the switch, says it's on this port here, and then only forwards on that one port on the switch. Unlike a hub, whenever anybody talks on the hub, it hits the port and then is reproduced on every single other port on that hub. That's why basically it's a multi-port repeater. So the electricity is going to every single area, but on a switch, it's isolated to whatever port was the last one to use that MAC address. And when it comes down to like the ARP poisoning or the ARP attacks, basically you're trying to fool the switch into saying that your IP address or your system is the other system. So therefore, all traffic should no longer go to that IP. It should go to your IP.
So can people steal cable like this? Where I know, when you go to hook up to Comcast, they say we need your MAC address, and they're gonna open the switch on their end. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
People simply manipulating MAC addresses and things like that.
Well, depending on how the infrastructure is set up, that's a possibility. A lot of them will have it to where it's a decoder, so it's scrambled until it gets to that area, and then they're only supposed to be able to talk to specific hardware.
Right.
So I guess in theory what you could do, depending on the infrastructure, is either inject yourself right beside it or branch yourself off of it and then pretend to be that same MAC address and then decode it from yours as well. But you would have to have a decoder, which then that's theft of services, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but people do have descramblers for that. But yeah, this misdirects the traffic to the attacker's computer, because when it ends up going through is saying that, yes, I have a different IP address, but I'm the same MAC address, it should go to me instead of the previous one. ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. This is basically, it's not a transmission for data. It's not supposed to be used for any sort of communications. Basically what it's supposed to be there for is an administration only. So you send an ICMP packet to a system, it then sends the information back to you, and you can tell if the system's up. You can tell if there's any data loss. For example, if you send an ICMP packet that's 5 meg, it hits the system, that entire 5 meg should make it back to you. If it doesn't, you know that something's dropping off the data. However, if you do that, there's a very good possibility or probability IDSs will flip because it's a large ICMP packet. Okay, ICMP, basically status and error message protocol, not used to move user data. Ping Utilities uses protocol by default. Windows traceroute uses this by default. Unix traceroute uses UDP protocol by default, but can use ICMP as a secondary. And when it responds back, again, it usually comes back with ICMP. ICMP uses by hackers. Sometimes they're allowed through a lot of firewalls. So what can happen is you can do a ping scan on a network and it gets past the firewall. However, some networks do block ICMP because they do not want a lot of the scanning utilities to show their servers as actually being active. There's another way of doing it is you can redirect traffic by spoofing or sending bogus ICMP to a router. Router thinks that it's another router telling you that the link is down or congested. So sometimes you can send ICMP to reroute traffic. Other ways that you can use ICMP is a covert channel. So you can put data in the ICMP packet and then send it to an outside area. There's been several utilities or attack utilities, say distributed denial service attacks, that would use ICMP as the payload generator. Another attack, good old Smurf attacks. How many people have heard of that before? You're going to need to know what a Smurf and a Fraggle DOS is. A Smurf is when you get an ICMP packet, then you send it to a broadcast address. Everybody within that broadcast range then is going to respond back to the source address that you sent it from. But the trick from the attacker's side is they spoof that source address to the actual true target. So whenever they send the ICMP packet, everybody thinks that it actually came from the target, and now they're going to respond back to that target, which is an amplification attack. So for every one ICMP packet you send to the broadcast, however many computers are on that broadcast network are then going to send traffic back to that target. So the primary issue is that basically you're trying to do resource starvation and take the system down because you're flooding it with so many resources. Okay, and the other thing, how many people here have heard of moon bouncing? Moon bouncing? Moon bouncing is basically the capability of using that same method for ICMP and packet spoofing. Is you spoof a source address, use a program to encapsulate data, you ping some server out on the internet, and that server or that system or asset is going to then respond to your spoofed address. That spoofed address is actually going to have another program listening to it and then take all the data out that you sent to it and then communicate back and forth. So effectively using ICMP and spoofing the source addresses, you have made not only a covert channel, but a true spoofing channel throughout the internet. Okay, ICMP types. You have your good old 0, which is echo reply. You have your 3 destination host unreachable or destination reachable, all the way through 14, timestamp reply. It's good to know them. Probably not as important as like cable types and things like that. There's a possibility you may come across, for example, like destination host unreachable or echo, or even the timestamp failures. But again, the caveat is that you will come across this in more advanced networking. because, for example, like if you're doing the ethical hacker or some of the like Cisco tests, things like that, they may come across this type of scenario because they want you to be able to troubleshoot why the network's failing. But on the CISSP, you need to know that ICMP has different types and also error codes within each type. And the common ones that are very good to know are the echo reply, destination host or reachable, probably, yeah, echo request, and then the timeouts. So time exceeded 11, and possibly 13 and 14, which is request and reply for timestamp. Because sometimes if they're blocking ICMP, you can trick them into responding anyway, just by sending a non-standard ICMP request. Such again as probably your 9s and your 13. So you're looking for timestamp as opposed to that. And I believe Nmap has that as one of the P options. So -P, and then I think it's N or whatnot for specific ping parameters. Okay, protocols, SNMP. This is your simple network management protocol. There's a master and an agent model. Basically, the agent gathers status information about a network device. And then the master polls the agent and provides the overall view of the network status. There's usually two different strings. There's a public string and a private string. By default, they're named public string and private string. And what's funny about it is that a lot of people that change it from the defaults, because if anybody knows the public string, they can then read the public string as long as they have network access to that port. Same thing with private. They can read and write to that device if they know the port or have access to the port. Some people will change the public and private to company name -public and then company name -private string. So if you're doing a pen test, a lot of times, the majority of the time, if they changed it, you can usually guess what it is unless they have a good naming convention or operation security conscious naming conventions. Okay, SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. Basically transmits mail between different mail servers. This protocol is used to send outgoing email from email clients. Security issue with mail servers improperly configured, they can be used as a relay. So what ends up happening is if they don't validate who it's going to or who it's coming from, then anybody can find it and then start dumping all kinds of email to all kinds of random individuals. From an attacker's perspective, if you protect against that and you're no longer a relay, what some people can do is then connect directly to the SMTP server and then try to enumerate all the users in your network by using either the verify command. If that is turned off, then they'll also use the receipt to command. So they do the mail from either a fake or a real email address and then a receipt to, and then basically try to brute force and then see if they get a response that says sender OK or potential error. If it says sender OK, they just send an rset command and then starts the communication back and forth. But with that being said, a lot of the email servers out there now are protected against mail relays. However, if you're doing a spear phishing attack, you can still send internal users emails through this method because they don't validate who the sender is. They just validate that the recipient is a current user on their network. Okay, FTP, TFTP, and Telnet. FTP, that is going to be clear text. Moves files between source and destination, weak authentication, data credentials, again, transferring clear text. FTP is going to be a TCP protocol. Port 21 is the primary connection port. Port 20 is going to be the data transfer. TFTP, what protocol does that use? TCP or UDP? It's actually UDP. It's one of the funny things is because we know a lot of the network devices are still using TFTP to upload the operating systems to these network devices, but it is one that is not connection full, it's a connectionless protocol, so there's no guarantee that all the packets will actually get there. There's no authentication. It's a limited command set compared to FTP and used mainly for routers to pull down configs. Another fun thing about TFTP, the client is going to be on all Windows operating systems pre-Vista. So whenever attacking a system, a lot of people, if they got command line capability, or even the web servers for the directory transversal, they try to get the TFTP command to run to download on one line, basically the Trojan or backdoor that they're going to be doing. For example, the good old TFTP space -I, which is going to force a binary transfer, space the target TFTP server name, space get, space the file that you're trying to get. That one line goes through, since there is no authentication, just grabs that file and starts automatically downloading it. And then the next line in a directory transversal would be running that program. So within 2 lines of code or 2 lines of URLs, then you just backdoored the system. Telnet, Terminal Emulation Protocol, works on a remote system through basically where it's working locally, and credentials and data are transferred in clear text. Again, definitely not a good thing. If you need command line access to a system, encrypt it, SSH.